Welcome back, everybody. Our next presentation is Data Resources for Precision Health Research by Professor Clara Lajonchere. Lajonchere, did I pronounce that?
Yep, Lajonchere.
Lajonchere. So Dr. Lajonchere is an adjunct professor of neurology and deputy director of Institute for Precision Research, Precision Health at UCLA. She is an elected chair of the California Precision Medicine Advisory Council. She received her PhD from Washington University, St. Louis in 2000. Her research focuses on disorders affecting the central nervous system with an emphasis on psychiatric, genetics, and translational medicine. She has held several academic and leadership positions, including director of the NIH Center for Genomic and Phenomic Studies in Autism at USC Keck School of Medicine and vice president of clinical programs for the science and advocacy program, organization, Autism Speaks. Dr. Lajonchere has worked in the field of autism for over a decade. She was the chief scientific officer for Cogneo Incorporation, a digital healthcare company, and has consulted for several tech startups in the autism area, focused on artificial intelligence, robotics, and targeted therapeutics. So welcome, Dr. Lajonchere. I'm sorry for the pronunciation.
Oh, don't worry. No worries.
Used to it. So it's all yours. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let me share my screen. Let me just, okay. Okay, let's try that again. There we go. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. So as mentioned, I'm here to talk about something slightly different. I'm going to focus, everything that I'm going to focus on is on the UCLA health side. And through the UCLA Institute for Precision Health, one of our goals, and let me just move over here. Okay. One of the goals and visions for the Institute, which really was started in 2016, has been, and I've highlighted here the areas that are most relevant, I believe, to the folks on the call, is really to facilitate collaboration across our campus, to stimulate discovery and innovation, and infrastructure building to really support precision health research across the clinical and research enterprise. On the right, you'll see these overlapping circles, because we really are looking across our campus to bring together folks from economics, from life sciences, computational medicine, engineering, computer science, anything with digital innovation, and of course, genomic medicine and the clinical enterprise. Because again, if you think about precision health as really a big data initiative, what we're doing is trying to gather as much data as we can and then format it in such a way where people can then have access to it and our computer science to develop algorithms and just really use it to the max capacity. And again, I'll talk about some restrictions on the data, but for the most part, all UCLA researchers would have access to these data sets that I'm going to be talking about. So I just want to talk very briefly, provide an overview of some of our signature initiatives within the Institute. The one I'm going to focus on is here on the top left, the Atlas 150K. It's the Community Health Initiative. The California Center for Rare Diseases. We've also developed a Center for Smart Health, and we're also focused on precision diagnostics. So developing translational cores, as an example, we just launched a stem cell gene editing core. We have many different similar translational cores, cancer genomics, and of course, a depression grand challenge, which is one of the campus grand challenges here at UCLA. So the focus, I wanted to give you an idea of what the Atlas Community Health Initiative was, so you could then get to tie the resources to, the goals for this initiative, the resources we built tie back directly to the goals. So really the vision for this was to create a powerful and robust cloud-based clinical and multi-omic data resource from a diverse sample of patients across our health system. And we started with 150,000 for those that do genomic research or have been involved in it in some way. Really, genetics is all about statistics, and statistics is all about numbers. And so 150,000 is really just starting to get close enough to make to derive any meaningful conclusions from the data. But 150,000 is sort of the low end. And so we created this bar because we were building everything from scratch. So what this initiative what we've done is developed innovative technology here on the left for consenting patients across our health system. And it's Westwood, Santa Monica, and all of the clinics that UCLA Health touches, as far south as San Diego and as far north as Sacramento. And so we recruit patients to allow us to share their biological specimens, anything left over from a lab test or to power our precision health biobank. So we have so each of the components is the consent to recruit them, and it's all integrated with the electronic health record. Central biobanking. So when we collect specimens from patients, they're going to one place where they're collected, stored, and accessioned. Then we are performing funding through the School of Medicine, and now one of our industry partners, we're doing SNP genotyping and also whole exome sequencing on all of the patients in the biobank. And then with colleagues, with some of our precision health faculty member, Paul Boutros, who's also the interim vice dean of research for the School of Medicine, developing a high performance computing infrastructure so that we're able to manipulate these extremely large data sets. So when we talk about integration, we're talking about taking electronic health data from patients and integrating it with the varying biological data sets that we're generating through research. So combining genomics and electronic health record data is incredibly promising for personalized medicine. And here there's a graphic, and UCLA is over there on the right. And our precision health biobank has grown exponentially, has doubled in size since this paper was published in 2019. So really, we here are uniquely positioned to identify populations that are diverse. We're able, through the electronic health record, to look at data longitudinally. And because we are recruiting across our health system, which is huge, we stand the opportunity to generate sample sizes that are large. Here's an example of a dashboard. We use Tableau. So all of the data, the clinical data are obviously they're in the Azure cloud. All health system data, all clinical data live in the Azure cloud. And you take data out of the Azure cloud. So part of the high performance computing infrastructure that we've been developing is how to manipulate data within that cloud framework. You can't download it onto a desktop or a thumb drive. So all of it is kept securely within the cloud. Now here, with respect to Atlas, we have consented 134,000 plus patients. We have an opt-in rate of 68%. So currently there are 92,460 patients that have consented to become part of the Precision Health Biobank. We have, here is on the lower left, we have a male-female ratio, so just slightly more women than men. When we're looking at race and ethnicity, we have, even though these numbers seem small, it is one of the more diverse collections out there. The National Institutes of Health, they just released data for their All of Us research program, and that is taking basically what we're doing here at UCLA, and they've taken it nationwide, and they have an emphasis for underrepresented minorities. When we look at the age distribution over on the right, We initially we were skewing towards the older an older population, but since we've been able to integrate with the electronic health record and we're able to recruit individuals who are younger. The goal here when we're developing a sampling strategy, we didn't want to end up with a large number of patients who were either very old or chronically sick. We want to balance that out with healthy controls, so to speak, so that we, at the end of the day, we have a very balanced data set. Just to highlight that LA is the largest and most ethnically diverse in the US. And here is just an example, and this combines some race and ethnicity data. So 46% of LA County residents are indeed non-white Hispanic. So it's very interesting to see how what we have been very closely monitoring the demographics of the UCLA health population and how Atlas compares to them as opposed to the LA County population. And so when we look at our Atlas distributions, they very much are representative of the UCLA health population. We have yet to go, and through our collaborations, we are trying to better approximate the data in across LA County. Now, we know that diverse race and ethnicity, these are essential to accurate genetic prediction. So the fact that we are trying to oversample for individuals that are non-white Caucasian is really critical. All of the reference norms for our genomic analyses are really based on white Northern Europeans, and they've been overrepresented in research. So now, but it really is critical for us when we think of different genetic mutations and variants on the health side, even having a small number of folks from either an African American community or the Latino community could have prevented certain clinical misclassifications. So in some cases, and in this paper specifically, there were certain variants that were pathogenic or disease causing in white Northern Europeans that were actually not disease causing in African Americans, and vice versa. So we have to make sure that if we're going for a more personalized approach, that we are able to look at the atlas of genetic diversity so that we can more appropriately develop and target the right treatments for the right patients at the right time. So here are the demographics of UCLA Health on the top, and then of the Atlas population on the bottom. And what we if you start looking and breaking this apart and looking at the different ratios, what you realize is that Atlas patients seem to be sicker than the average healthy patient across UCLA Health. And so we're really digging into the data to try to understand why. Now, one of the biggest the biggest partnerships that we've struck through the Institute, and again, one of our key missions, as I mentioned earlier, is infrastructure building. We partnered with UCLA Health IT, specifically their Office of Health Informatics and Analytics. And they've developed, we have, again, over here in the cloud, you'll see all of our genomic data will live there. Our Discovery Data Mart lives there, and that's basically an extract of the clinical data that's common data elements that we have segregated and identified here, so that you can use that for your the genomic analyses. The different data stores here, they're all on the clinical side in different ways, shapes, and forms. We have solutions and services. So here, the Azure Data Factory, we use Databricks, which is it's very related to our the data discovery mart, and so you can more seamlessly integrate and query the genetic and clinical data together. And then on the right, these are the different tools that they also make available. So our researchers required, all of us used things, we used the Hoffman cluster, but all of our investigators now had to migrate to the cloud because that was that was the mandate from above. So if you are going to do research with clinical health information, then you're going to be working in the cloud and working in partnership with using these solutions and different tools. So specifically, I've mentioned the Data Discovery Mart, or we call it the Data Discovery Repository. And what does it include? It includes lab tests. It includes ICD codes. These are diagnostic codes. These are standardized diagnostic codes. We are looking at de-identified patient demographic information, social, behavioral, age, sex, race, and ethnicity, et cetera. And then we also have, different information about the kind of visit. Was it an emergency visit, a follow-up visit? What kind of encounter was it? And having medication data is really, really critical. So you can link out to other databases as well. Now, I'm going to spend a second talking specifically about Atlas genomic data resources. And this, we've been developing these in collaboration with our Center for We have a Center for Translational Science award from the NIH, and there are about 60 most premier academic institutions have one. And so through a grant from the CTSI, I am leading this year the Precision Health module. We've been able to develop these resources. So we have two parallel genomic data repositories. We have about 50,000 samples that have been genotyped. When we think about how do we analyze or interrogate the genome, a genotype, these are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So they're little points along the genome that are going to be relevant to the identification of common and or rare genetic variation, mostly common. And then as you sort of move up to the whole genome sequencing, meaning you're looking at every base pair in the genome, that's more costly. And a lot of folks are still using that on the research side, but it's not really mainstream on the clinical side. And then whole exome sequencing, it really focuses on the protein coding regions of the genome. And so that's where most common variation lives. And also we're using that for also to identify rare variation, looking at rare genomic variants. So as we think about, we have genotyped, which is a very sort of a base level of genomic analysis, over 50,000 patients currently. And we developed a database called Genomics-DB, which is the third one listed here on the right. We have VCF is the standard storage file storage for data are stored as sparse arrays, and it contains comprehensive genomic. It's a comprehensive genomic data store. And when we developed this, our vendor really, they were requiring the use of a Zeppelin notebook and Scala, and now we're able. They've also added Jupyter and Python to the mix. I2B2 is the NIH through the CTSI. They also have clinical data. So I2B2 has mostly been used to identify cohorts based on clinical and now genetic attributes. So if you're looking for a particular cohort, you would go to I2B2. You could also use Tableau if you're going to be in the cloud. And to identify people that have a particular mutation in a particular gene that's of interest. You can also do the reverse, and you can look at people with cardiomyopathy and see if there's any genetic information for those patients. And the access is through a GUI. And then Plink on the top, I'm starting from the bottom up, very compact compression. It's designed for genetic association applications, and you would access this using Linux command line with a Jupyter Notebook, Python. So here you can see how on the left you have Genomics-DB with a plugin to I2B2, which is the clinical data store. This is in the Amazon cloud, and that's, but we are migrating I2B2, the clinical data store, into the Azure cloud. So they're parallel. In the Azure cloud now, everything is migrating over there because that's the source of truth. That's where all of the data live. So most people have been we were able to create an extract for some researchers in Azure, in AWS, which is what we use on the school side. But now everything is migrating over to the health system, and everything is going to be living within the Azure cloud. But they are two parallel ways of getting at the same data. Here's an example. Here's some Zeppelin paragraphs with Scala code on how you might go about retrieving genotype data from samples at specific genomic locations. And so really it has a very simple query interface. Now, through the Institute, we've also developed additional tools for cohort discovery and analysis. A colleague of mine, Dr. Alex Bowie, he's part of the Precision Health faculty. One of the things he's been looking to do is can you use NLP for digital phenotyping? So this is a concept-based repository for documents. So we're looking at, so if there are discrete fields within the electronic health record, that's easy to extract. But what about things that are embedded in notes that can give us clues as to patient status? And so the number of unique Atlas patients that have been indexed at the end of 2021 exceeds 54,000. And the number of searchable clinical notes exceeds 12 million. And then additionally, we've been able to link that with radiology reports, and that exceeds 1 million on just Atlas patients. So this is a ton of data. And so all of this, of course, these tools, as we're going through it, here's an example. This is an example of the architecture and data flow. There's, again, right here, we could talk about it's scalable cloud-based VMs, parallel processing. And here there's lots of constant iterations of this. We're really trying, the goal in step 3 here is to refine cohort identification based on these concepts that are based on Atlas results, clinical notes, and conventional filters. So the goal here is extensive, the planned goal is extensible automated associated feature extraction pipelines for AI and machine learning based on different projects and users. So we're trying to create a tool that folks can utilize. And these are folks that may not be well versed on, all of the different technologies, although we definitely want users to be working with people that understand it. We don't want technology to be the barrier. This is an example of what the query interface looks like that Alex and others have built. And Alex, he's been at UCLA about over 20 years. He's a professor in radiology, and as I mentioned, a Precision Health faculty member. And so the goal here was to create tools that would be easy. So you could, it's sort of easy pull down menus and clicking around. And here you can specify your cohort characteristics, either in terms of a patient's medical problem list, and then you can use the search fields to specify disease or conditions to locate the different ICD codes, or a fee code, which I'll get to in a minute, or any other ontology codes that you're looking for. And then here on the right, your current query, it says that you have the following one condition ready to be executed. Here you can further refine the concept. For example, here are all of the different the different diagnostic codes underneath this particular concept ID. So it's taking, if you're looking at cerebellar ataxia, it's taking all of the diagnostic codes, or at least all of the keywords for cerebellar ataxia and making those available to the user. And we're using a lot of neurologic codes here. I'm in the Department of Neurology, but a lot of the work that we've been doing has been with neurologic patients. So here is, for example, what the search returns, and this is partial document content. Again, this is PHI, protected health information. So you would need an IRB to be able to access this. We are still in the process of trying to figure out how to extract. So mostly physicians will say 81-year-old Hispanic female seen with her dad for X and Y disease, X, Y, or Z symptoms, and then the physician will in that note may mention the person's name, and that's where it automatically becomes identifiable. So again, lives within that Azure cloud, within that firewall. And again, researchers would need IRB approval. And this is what the note would look like in the EHR. And what it does, the system then highlights the terms that you were searching for so that it just pulls up that note. And here on the right, you can see all of the different clinical documents for the different patients that have those particular keywords that you've identified. So that's the NLP tool that, Alex Buescke has developed. We've also another faculty member, Bogdan Pasanyuk, who is a faculty member in pathology and human genetics. He and his graduate students developed fee codes that we use specifically and have applied specifically to the DDR, the Data Discovery Repository. These were the students at the time in 2019. Malika has since graduated. What are fee codes? Well, fee codes, as I alluded to earlier, especially in the previous ataxia, cerebellar ataxia example, they're groupings of ICD codes that are used to represent distinct diseases or traits, and we use them for clinical and genetic research. So here on the left, you have ICD-9 and 10, and these change periodically from, you know, they get updated, things are added or deleted, and therefore there's a new version. These are all of the things for, let's just use this respiratory and upper respiratory infections that could be associated. So we have 13,000 ICD-9 and 68,000 ICD-10. And when we collapse them using a meaningful concept, we create a fee code that we are defining as acute upper respiratory infection of multiple or unspecified sites, and we end up with 1,800 fee codes. So it's a way to synthesize data in a meaningful concept-driven way. As an example, here are the top 20 neurologic, here we were looking at all sorts of different conditions. We broke out neurologic conditions, and on the right, you can see that in a sample of 100,000 patients, there were 1.8 million diagnostic events. And these are the fee codes that we were able to come up with for headache, chronic pain, migraine, insomnia. And as we go through what we were able to do, or what Bogdan's lab, what they were able to do, I take no credit for any of this, is that they were able to sort of break patients down in a meaningful way that we could then use for research. Another tool that they've developed has to do with genetic ancestry, and several of our faculty are working on genetic ancestry and linking that to clinical data. When we look at the atlas distribution of specific phenotypes across different demographic groups, they were able to show the distribution of 7 distinct traits across sex, age, and inferred genetic ancestry. And so this gives us a nice snapshot. So here we have asthma, we have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, we have gout, we have heart failure, we have idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, stroke, and venous thromboembolism. And so it looks as though males are overrepresented here. Here you can look at the age distribution across these categories. And then down here, we can look at ancestry. And so now you can start to see whether there's any particular ancestral group that is seems to be over or underrepresented across these 7 different traits. So these are all tools that we have been developing within the Institute in partnership with our collaborators. A colleague of mine, he's also in human genetics and in the Department of Neurology, Noah Zaitlin. He was able to look at, as an example, creatinine and how it's represented across the different ancestries. And here in this graph, what you should see is, or take away, is that African-American patients are 3 times more likely to exceed the upper threshold for creatinine. And this is data that was done in partnership with Eran Halpern who was a faculty member in computational medicine and computer science. He came to us from Israel, from Tel Aviv University, where he dedicated his entire career to really looking and combing through electronic health records for different patterns of mortality and morbidity as it pertained to patients, post-surgical patients, pre and post-surgical patients. So I believe that that's my last slide. I think we're out of time, but I did want to, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I know that this is not also, the most traditional talk, that workshop, being included in this workshop is not as the traditional. So I really appreciate the reach out, because we are always really excited to talk to folks about the different opportunities to access research if you're interested in patient or clinical outcomes, or working with clinical health data and genetics and genomics. And as we generate more data, if it's on proteomics or other kind of biological data, we will also be making this available to the broader research community. So again, we are conveners, we are facilitators, we are builders. And we just announced a fellowship program. It's actually a fellowship award for one outstanding medical trainee, MD or MD PhD, as an example. It's a mentored training program so that they could become more involved in data science through computational medicine and quantitative biology. There are also opportunities for different folks to attend workshops to learn how to use the tools that I've just talked about for their own research. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. And also, if for further information, you can contact Mariam Arianajad, who in the Institute for Precision Health. She's a computer scientist by training. She's my director of operations for the Institute, and also senior program manager. And she'll be able to answer any questions related to any of the things that I've just talked about. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Clara. And thank you for the excellent talk and the resource, very important to the researchers working in this field. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Lisa. Unmute, yes.
Yes, we only have a minute before the next presentation. Thank you very much for the discussion of the Institute and for all the work that you're doing. Just a strange kind of ethical question for you. What are the discussions you all are having about, let's say, reaching back to your patients in the event of a discovery about some genetic?
That's an excellent question, and I will try to answer that in 20 seconds. We have a partnership with the Regeneron Genomics Center. If those of you remember the monoclonal antibody cocktails, they were made by Regeneron. Well, we're working with them in a different capacity, and they are doing the whole exome sequencing on all of our biobank participants. Part of that collaboration requires us to return actionable genetic findings to patients that participate in the biobank. So what are actionable genetic findings? They're not research findings, they're clinical findings for which there is an immediate action to take. So if you think about the BRCA mutations that increase risk for prostate and breast, hereditary breast ovarian cancers, those are the kinds of things that we would be returning to patients. If we find, cardiomyopathy genes, if there's a hit on any of those, familial hypercholesterolemia, you can be in your 30s and think that you're fine and then drop dead of a heart attack. Those are the kinds of findings that we are now, I'm building the infrastructure to actually, with investment from the health system, because that's a clinical unit. So the research unit then needs to partner, and we have to cross that clinical research chasm. So that's an incredibly important point, because we demand that the value be returned back to our patients. So if you have any more questions about that, feel free to let me know. But yes, that is a huge part of this ecosystem.
Excellent, thank you.
Any more question? If not, I would like to ask one. You mentioned that you are transferring from AWS to Azure. What's
Yes.
the reason for?
So when we first started, there hadn't been this mandate. Again, on the research side, for the School of Medicine, it's the school IT. We call it Digit. They're the ones that we were working with, and what we wanted was to get a continuous extract of the EHR data and put it in AWS. It was less costly. It was, researchers were able to use it much more easily and had more unfettered access to AWS so that they could play with the genetic and the clinical data. Unfortunately, the Vice Chancellor for Health put a stop to that and said that all health data must remain in the Azure cloud. So we are in the, so for example, if you were to look at Genomics DB in its current instance, it only has 10,000 genomic data files in it, as opposed to 50,000 that we have in Azure. So we've just made the decision to turn off our AWS servers, the ones that support this work, because everything just has to live in Azure.
Okay. Thank you. Any other question?
And I am happy to answer other questions by email. Unfortunately, I have to drop off right now, but it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Clara.
Take care.
You. So I see our next speaker is online.
And it sounds like I'm perfect timing, because I was struggling mightily to find the right Zoom coordinates.
Let me make sure that you are able to share the screen. And this session is being recorded. I hope we can share it later on.
Sure, no problem.
So, thank you, Frank, for joining. Let me just try to introduce you. I know you for a long time. Our next speaker is Professor Frank Wuerthwein. He will speak on open infrastructure. So we learned about the open science-based software. We learned the data availability, and this is an interesting approach, which is the open infrastructure. I'm happy to have Frank on as the speaker in this workshop. Professor Frank Wuerthwein is a physics professor at UCSD, University of California, San Diego. He is currently a director of San Diego Supercomputing Center. Prior to UCSD, he was a professor at MIT and also worked at Caltech. And he was OSG's founding executive during 2005. And is again serving as its executive director since February 2015. Professor Wuerthwein received his PhD from Cornell in 1995. He is an expert in experimental particle physics and advanced computation. His primary physics interest lies in searching for new phenomena at the high energy frontier with the CMS detector at the LHC. Topics of interest include, but not limited to, the search for dark matter and electroweak symmetry breaking. So without much delay, I'll invite Professor Frank. Professor Frank, it's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I am going to talk about work we're doing towards a national research platform that federates all academic cyber infrastructure in the USA. And let me first make sure you see me switching slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start by motivating this with the need to democratize science, or the need to democratize access. And there's a very most eloquent formulation of this that I know of comes from a grassroots organization called the Minds We Need. And I put down their website at the bottom here. And the way that they phrased it is that we want to connect every community college, every minority serving institution, and every college and university, including all urban, rural, and tribal institutions, to a world-class and secure research and education infrastructure with particular attention to institutions that have been chronically underserved. That's the objective. And now, why do we want to do this? We want to do this because we want to engage and empower every student and researcher everywhere with the opportunity to join collaborative environments of the future, simply because we cannot know where the next genius comes from. And that's a very simple statement. And to my mind, it's a very powerful statement, and it's a very obvious statement. And that's what motivates me personally to work on these kinds of things. So now, what's the long-term vision, and how does it sit within the kind of things that you've already heard about? The long-term vision is literally a direct derivative of what you just saw by the Minds We Need. Create an open national cyber infrastructure that allows the federation of all CI and all, of CI and all 4,000 accredited degree granting institutions, non-profit research institutions, and national laboratories. Basically, anybody anywhere in the US who is in one way or the other part of the academic research complex should have access to this, should be allowed to benefit from it, and should be allowed to contribute to it. And you all know what open science is: open data, open source. Now I'm adding to this the notion of open infrastructure, and I'll explain what I actually mean by this. But let's first enumerate. There's computation, there is storage and content delivery networks, and in my mind, possibly in the future, devices, instrumentation, instruments, IoT, anything really that you can imagine wanting to connect to a national infrastructure. For all I know, wireless devices, the generation 6, 5, 7, 10, whatever in the future of how wireless gets done. The devices at any kind of devices that are placed in order to understand traffic, to understand air pollution, to understand fire, you name it. All of those kinds of things could, in principle, join such an open infrastructure by getting connected into it in order to provide data, to provide benefit compute, benefit from storage. And this kind of open infrastructure is part of the assembly of all the open things that we have here in order to bring openness for an open society. And I'm sure that you've talked already about this, that especially today, when you open the newspaper, when I open in the morning the New York Times, I get reminded every single day how important openness for an open society is, and how important an open society is. And we've sort of forgotten this almost, given that we were so complacent in the last last decade or so. And I think that this sort of fits straight into all of this in terms of a long-term vision for infrastructure. Now, next, let's go to what do I actually mean by open infrastructure? Let me go at it with a couple of statements that both first describe what I want to accomplish and then will describe what our founding principles have to be. I want to be maximally exploring the power of sharing. Any institution shall be able to dynamically share any fraction of its resources with any other. This is especially important because more and more of science and research at our institutions is collaborating not just within our institutions, but also across institutions. And therefore, researchers that have resources ought to be able to pool their resources into the collaborations that are part of. That's a really, really important principle. And we do this actually with the examples that I'd show you later. In addition, we should be able to have the funding agencies stipulate that the money they give us should in part be used for institutions that don't have, that are less affluent, that have they're less resourced, they don't have massive endowments, etc., 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 to allow the democratization of science and the kind of things that I had on my previous slide. So I think power of sharing is pretty obvious to me, at least. The next one is, how do you do this in such a way that control still stays with the owners? And that gets me to federation and distributed control. I think the fundamental policy has to be that resource owners determine policy of use for what they own. We live in a capitalist society. There's no way around this. And capitalism means people who own something get to decide on what it's used for. It's that simple. And that implies policies are set locally at the resource. At the same time, resource consumers should be able to determine policy for what they're willing to use. They might have all kinds of priorities, preferences. There might be things that organizations that they don't want to run on because they don't trust. There are cybersecurity issues involved here. Bottom line is, a resource consumer determines the policy of what they're willing to use, an owner determines the policy of who is allowed to use what they have, and the federated system simply matches consumers to owners, respecting both sets of policies. So policy is fundamentally declared locally, and the global system or national system just makes sure that policies are respected and executed and enforced. And this is the kind of system that we want to build. And in fact, we have built. How can this possibly scale is then the first question, right? Or the next question. And to be quite honest, it doesn't. The biggest challenge in producing something like this is not to actually come up with the processes and whatnot to make it happen. We have done that. And I'll show you the state of the art later. The biggest challenge is, how do you scale what we have today, which is order 100 institution, to order 1,000 institution? I'm off by an order of magnitude between state of the art and where I want to go. And that is really, proving to be hard. And it's hard for fundamental reasons, because resource owners want a minimal threshold for participation, and resource consumers want a minimal threshold for participation. But both of them have constraints that make actually the creation of the infrastructure maximally hard, because both want to have no effort, but both require that somebody else does all the effort. And therefore it makes scalability difficult, because there's a fat middleman or middle person that has to do all of the complicated stuff and that has to be implemented via cyber infrastructure, software, process, and human teams. And that mediating the gap between the desires of the owner and the desire of the consumer is the scalability problem. Because if you want to reach 1,000 institutions and probably millions of consumers, that is a real challenge. And so what's the state of the art? Where are we? What do we have? And the state of the art is that we know today three ways to get federations done, because we've done them actually. We have actually made federations that work at 3 different layers. And they're listed here from the top, which is the lowest in the stack, to the bottom, which is the highest in the stack. So we have a federation in deployment today that Pacific Research Platform has implemented this, where orchestration is where it's federated at the orchestration layer, meaning at Kubernetes layer, or even below the Kubernetes layer. We do use IPMI in order to remotely install operating systems onto computers. And I'll talk more about this later. And the other opposite extreme is we have OSG has implemented a federation where they federate at the storage and compute clusters. So if you have a storage system, a file system that is petabytes worth, we can actually bring this into a federation of file systems. And I'll talk more about this later. And if you have a compute cluster, we can federate your compute cluster with compute clusters nation and globally. And I'll talk how that works also later. So basically, we have artifacts in deployment that do this at these 3 layers. And I've skipped the middle one because it's sort of less deployed. But we have done it also in the middle one. So none of this is rocket science. And the important statement is that how you federate depends entirely on how much control you want to have. If you're willing to give away root on your hardware, more power to you. We use IPMI and off we go. If you're not willing to do that, then you have to actually run your own compute clusters. You have to run your own storage. You need sysadmins that do all of this. And therefore, there's an awful lot of effort involved for you if you want to actually have control, meaning control costs money. Control implies more effort to join and operate, and it is directly opposite to the statement that most resource owners want in order to participate, meaning have no effort. And so some institutions will probably never be able to join because of a mismatch between the effort they have and the control they desire, because the control is your choice as an institution. Whether you can afford that control is possibly outside of the realm of possibility for you. And so now, bottom line, we have a complementarity implementation of a bring your own resource model where people can join the cyber infrastructure either at the very bottom of the layer of the stack or higher up in the stack. Either which way, OSG focused on campus cluster integration, PRP focused on individual node integration instead of clusters. In the following, I'll introduce both of these models. Let's start with PRP. It has a bring your own resource philosophy. And the way that PRP talks about it is from soup kitchen to potluck supercomputing, meaning people either behave like they go to a party that is potluck and they bring their own hardware, or sometimes they don't have their own hardware. They behave like they're going to a soup kitchen and they're getting whatever somebody is willing to give for free. And both of these are models within which PRP and OSG actually work. And what PRP has done, it's pioneered the integration of Kubernetes, of a federated integration at the Kubernetes layer and at the IPMI layer. And in fact, if you want to do something like this, then you have to really start by the shopping list. So what PRP has done, in PRP, we provide a hardware shopping list for institutions. And every year this gets done from anew. And over the year, we then add new types of hardware that people have wanted and we have a solution for. And right now, the 2021 set of hardware that we propose to people, that we give you a shopping list for, what can you order from a vendor, has 11 different options, including 8-way GPU, a 4-way FPGA, and a 640 terabyte of SAS. Basically, the kind of components that you would think you would need in order to create infrastructure. The most popular is actually the 8-way GPU, because a lot of the people on PRP are computer scientists and actually engineers who do machine learning. And you can then join either at the IPMI layer or at the KNS layer. And the global hardware integration is right now across 30 plus institutions. I actually don't know the exact number. I think it's around 35. It's out of those, interestingly, 11 are minority serving institutions, 8 of them in California. PRP started in California, therefore it is a heavily West Coast oriented thing that is currently, has now expanded across the globe. And the Nautilus Kubernetes cluster that we operate is literally has nodes all the way in Australia, in Korea, all over the world, but it is heavily focused. The majority of the nodes are actually on the West Coast. User interfaces, you can read yourself. It's 500 plus GPUs, many petabytes of disk space, for mostly used for machine learning. Now, contrast this to the OSG model. Here, institutions operate their own compute and storage clusters. We provide software and services that allow integration of the clusters. What this really means is that we operate an overlay batch system. My group operates what we call a factory. It submits batch system daemons into clusters globally, and then those batch systems daemons call back home, and the actual application is pending in the overall. And anytime a new node shows up with some kind of hardware, only then we commit an application to that hardware. So people queue in our batch system, we submit our batch system in other people's batch systems, and voila, we create a global overlay. And it's really global. And we then have different pools for different customers. And the set of customers is a who's who in big science, basically, from the LHC to LIGO to IceCube to, but we have one for all of open science. So for the entire single PI community, anywhere, anybody can come to us and say, well, I want an account. Off you go. We also do data integration, and I'll talk more about all of these in a moment. So this is the map, obviously, of the world. Every green point is an organization. There's 149 green points listed on this map. And if you look in details in the US, these green points are across 64 institutions in the US, where I'll define what I mean by institution in a second. And so institution sharing, and we call this the Open Science Data Compute Federation, the OSG Compute Federation. And institutions, let me say a few words about the kinds of institutions. We count 64 US institutions contributed compute resources during the year ending on March 9th. We had our annual meeting on the week after March 9th, so that's where I got the data from. Important is that we count institutions as brick and mortar things. UCSD is an institution. It has 2 green dots, one for the San Diego Supercomputer Center and one for my group in the physics department. And across these 2 entities, there are 6 clusters that compute resources, including one that's entirely inside of the commercial cloud, and another one that itself has hardware across 30 institutions, meaning PRP, which I'm a co-PI of, is actually a node, is a cluster inside OSG, but it itself is made out of hardware from 30 plus institutions. And then of these 64 institutions in the USA, you have all kinds of types. 26 out of the 64 US institutions are either a minority serving institution in an EBSCO state or a non-R1. And my favorite non-R1 is actually what's it called? The American Museum of National History in New York City. The American Museum of National History is actually a research institution in its own right, and they have a cluster, and their cluster is part of OSG, and they have researchers which use OSG more broadly because they use our infrastructure. So OSG is clearly democratizing access to some point. So we're meeting some of the goals we have. Now to the Data Federation. This is the picture on the Data Federation. There are 2 concepts, a data origin, a data cache. The caches provide you something akin to a content delivery network. We currently have 20 caches, 6 of which are on the research and education network backbone, meaning we have caches inside ESNet and inside Internet 2. And Internet 2 is in essence one of these institutions provide hardware into the federated system. There are 10 data origins, including one in Europe. And the one in Europe is an interesting story. If the global network of gravitational wave observatories need to cooperate with each other for science reasons, and I won't go why, the science is interesting. Now, there is in production an instrument in Europe and 2 instruments in the US. The instrument in Europe likes to share its data via a European server. The 2 instruments in the US like to share their data via a US-based server. Voila, we have an origin in Europe and an origin in the US. And then they can be accessed by everybody in the joint collaboration, including a Japanese instrument, transparently, because the namespace is global. So the namespace of having data served from Europe, data served from the US is accessed on the compute node as one namespace, and the caches guarantee that you can actually access the data. There is a little bit of statistics, 90 research groups, 9 collaborations. LIGO and LIGO Virgo is one of these 9 collaborations, 1 campus. They read 32 petabytes of data out of a working set of 420 terabytes. If you divide these 2 numbers, you get 75. So the average reread factor is 75. This here is a poor man's histogram at something akin to a log scale of the reread multiplier and the number of projects that you have that kind of reread multiplier. My point is that it goes all over the map, many orders of magnitude. We have projects that have read the same data more than 10,000 times. And we have projects that read the same time data only 2 to 5 times. And accordingly, you get a very wide spread. You can join your data in 2 ways. Either you transfer it to our hardware, which we offer, and we give you a quota on it, and voila. Or more preferable is to federate the file system at your institution with our infrastructure. And this is sort of the mental picture that we have for doing this. Your file system may be behind your institutional firewall. We then require you to operate a piece of hardware that straddles the firewall and is dual homed. That piece of hardware needs to join some kind of Kubernetes cluster. Doesn't have to be ours, but it can be ours. And then we will install all of the services, maintain all of the services that mount whatever you export, and whatever you export is via this mount point then visible to the data federation. And we operate everything on that is in red, you operate everything that is in blue. And therefore you can join file systems that already exist with data that is on there, and you can decide daily if you wish, I'm gonna add this part of my file space because I'm gonna export this, and whatever I've exported, we pick up and export further. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, this is about as solid as it gets, right? Because you have complete control. Now, the functionality of the data origin can be as limited as just exporting your data read-only in the data federation. Data can be public or private. However, you can also use the fact that we provide you this integration by storing output for your people back in your server. So you could decide that most of my file system is read-only mounted or exported, and therefore mounted into the data federation. However, this little piece here, Jane Doe should have write access, and that little piece here, Jim Schmo should have write access. And therefore Jane Doe and Jim Schmo can run on OSG and bring back as part of the workflow the output to their own areas at my institution. And then that output gets read-only exported again so that it can be used for future processing. All of this works. Now, a word about namespace. There's one little piece of cleverness in this scheme, and that is that the global namespace is separate from the origins that hold the data. You can actually move data out of band to a different location. And once the data shows up in that different location and is registered via that origin on that remote place, the people who access your data will not know the difference. So behind the scenes here, origins and how they're accessed are actually totally dynamic. You can bring in a new origin, move data between origins, replicate data between origins out of band, outside of the realm of the data federation even knowing. And just in the origin software guarantees that it discovers that data is moved because it has the necessary failovers and has the necessary discovery mechanisms built into it. So the data federation has discovery of data built into it and doesn't keep any state. And that is crucial, or it keeps a little bit of state, but it's details. That is crucial and can actually be used to do a lot of interesting things. And now I want to show that this is actually real. These are projects that use this, and it's 70 projects have more than a terabyte working set. And here I've shown you by name the projects by ordered by the top readers. And you can see that some of the top readers are also pretty sizable data sets, but some of them are tiny. Like there's Malchris has a 5 GB data set, and it's accessed 507 terabytes worth. So it accesses on average, every piece of data has been accessed 115,000 times. And so that is, of course, a massively useful use of the content delivery network, because you cache to the wazoo, right? And then some of these, yeah, okay, fine, the reread multipliers go all over the map. And as you dig in, some of the large data sets have not that large a reread multiplier. They're not listed here because they don't have that much data reads, and that's what I ordered it by. The other thing that's interesting, some of these people are actually individual PIs, individual faculty with their labs. There's the Tufts Computer Architecture Lab. As best as I know, it's a single faculty, and his students or her students, I can't remember who it actually is. And then there is all kinds of other things. Basically, it covers all of science, or a large fraction of science, different kinds of things. And it covers all scales, from 1,000 people global big science experiments to individual PIs and individual institutions that just want to do stuff. What's next? Where are we going from here? We have a funded grant. We were awarded a grant, NSF 21-12-167, that will systematically help blow this up, in the sense that it includes 8 caches. I literally wrote this proposal. I'm the PI. I wrote this proposal, and by asking myself, what's the minimum number of caches that I need in order to achieve coverage for the continental United States? And then I asked myself, okay, fine, how far, given our experience with the existing infrastructure, how far should people be away from a cache? Ideally, no more than 500 miles. So I made circles of 500 miles, went on a map from Google and placed them. And voila, then I looked around, where does Internet 2 have actually, what are they called, POPs, where I could place something, and voila, that gave you the map. And you can see it's not perfect, and there's like, this is El Paso, if I remember correctly. El Paso is right in the middle of Arizona and Texas, and doesn't quite get covered from San Diego, and doesn't get quite covered from Houston. And so there are places where we don't have coverage, and so there's more to be done, and we'll work on blowing this up. But this is sort of the kind of thing that gives you a sense of that this is actually happening. Now, the other thing that we're doing with this proposal is we're introducing another concept, in fact, 2 more concepts. We're introducing the concepts of regional self-storage systems. So what I mean by this is we found that people are actually very eager to contribute hardware when they don't have to pay the money to operate that hardware. So the IPMI solution is actually attractive to many folks because it brings down the cost of ownership dramatically. And so what we're offering a solution for doing this even with data, so that we run self-storage systems that are not local to a data center, but local to a region. And whether or not this works depends on the size of the region, right? And how well it works depends on the size of the region. It will work no matter what. It just works poorly because of the speed of light being the limiting factor. And then the next thing we do, I've talked about the caches already, but all of these regional storage systems will be origins in the data federation. So we're therefore blowing up the total number of origins. And then in addition, we decided there's one thing that really people want to have. If you have regional storage, they also want to be able to say, I want to be able to have this part of my file system, this part of my namespace in my file system on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and that part of my namespace only in the center of the country near Chicago, and this one all the way down in Florida, because I'm going to be computing on this data in Florida, on that data on the East Coast, on this data on the West Coast, and on this data both on the East and the West. And so I want to give the end user, the researcher themselves, control over how their data is replicated across the regional storage systems, in order to give a little bit of additional extra, so that they don't only depend on the caching infrastructure, so that they can actually do read modified writes to some degree, because the regional storage is mounted in the region as storage. And so that's there's some amount of this is an experiential system. So we'll see how well this works. Summary and conclusion. It takes a cyber infrastructure ecosystem of collaborating projects to build and operate the open infrastructure that will achieve our joint vision. Meaning, if I want to achieve the vision that I set up at the very beginning of integrating, federating all infrastructure, all cyber infrastructure in the USA, or at least allowing them all, then I need a hell of a lot of help. There's no such thing. This vision is way too big to be managed or achieved by a single project that comes out of a single budget at the NSF. And so we have created the necessary structure. We've created a consortium that anybody can join. And we are encouraging anybody to join us, either as a consumer, or as a provider of resources, or as a software project that wants to figure out what can you do that we don't already do, or how can you help. For example, cyber training awards are an obvious thing to help us. We don't have the effort to reach everybody. It's impossible with the kind of money that we have. So we need to teach the trainers, and then the trainers needs to teach to get this action. We need to have a scaling out system of support, and to achieve our collective vision, we can use all the help we can get, and let's go on and collaborate. And if you want to get in on this, send me an email, and we'll figure out how you can help. And let me make one particular statement. I look at what we've accomplished as plumbing. We've plumbed the nation, and we're plumbing the world. We're plumbing to build a compute federation and a data federation, but there's an awful lot on top that is necessary for science to get done. Think of all kinds of metadata issues, FAIR, anything with FAIR, we don't even touch. There is so much in the data space, semantics and all kinds of things that we have chosen a priori to not get involved in, because we're more than busy just do the plumbing. And so if you have interests in the higher layers of the, and I'm not even sure how to call this, the higher layers of the intellectual property stack in data, if you wish, then I encourage you to work with us and work with our infrastructure and see how you can build on this. Because right now we have a very rudimentary global namespace. It's very simplistic. It basically, I give you a high level, top level part of the namespace, and you do whatever you want underneath. And I give out a new top level namespace every time a new person comes, a new institution comes, and therefore it scales, and you have no conflict, because I manage the top level and you manage everything underneath, and everything underneath is distributed. Everybody who owns it manages it, and they can again give out iteratively lower parts of their namespace in principle. So there is iterativeness in principle all available. And so, but there's so much more that people do in terms of namespaces and data management and data discovery and all that kind of jazz that we just don't touch, because it's just completely out of scope for us. We can't even reach what we want to reach just for the plumbing. We even there need help. Anyway, I think that's all I had. And as I said, I'm encouraging all of you to join us.
Thank you, Frank. Any questions from the audience? Lisa.
Sorry, I do seem to be the one with questions today. Thank you very much for your presentation. When you were talking about the data federation, you were talking about deposits from the partner institutions and origins. Can you say a few words about how this system plays well with the disciplinary or domain-specific repositories?
That's actually a thing we're exploring right now. So in principle, if this was a file system of the material commons, for example, then to the extent that we can mount this file system by this interface into our namespace and give the material commons a top level directory material commons, it is integrated. And then everything that happens underneath or anything else they do in order to support the material commons is automatically done by them anyway. So we don't interfere with that. However, the data will be visible on every single compute, because we make the entire namespace. We have two. I didn't really say this, but when you think about caching, there's really two caches involved. There's a namespace cache, which is the metadata cache, if you will. And then there is the actual data cache. we found that there is no technology that works equally well on very small files that you would normally use for namespaces and very large files that you would normally use for data. And so we therefore have separated the two and merged them together so that when you read, when you do an ls on some directory, it hits the namespace cache, but not the data cache. And when you actually process large data, move large data around and process files, you hit the file space cache and not the namespace cache. Now, making sense? So these two things are matched together, and what a domain size comments would come in, we would mount it, is basically the answer. Does that help?
It does. Thank you very much.
Julius?
Hi, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I had to jump out for a little bit, and I might have just missed it. But I know that some of the PANGEO folks are heavily working with the open storage network. Is there some overlap between these approaches, or are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the open storage network, and the main difference is OSN has decided to minimize, to do one thing and do that one thing very well, and it is entirely put and get. So it doesn't have any kind of notion of a file system. It's built around object store and the notion that you can put and you can get. You can have basically S3 kind of semantics, but you can't mount, open, and that kind of thing. And so what we're doing right now is we have a project that is independently funded that will take an OSN pod and import it into the OS data federation via an origin, and where the software that we have has plugins for different kind of backends. And so they're proposing to write a plugin for the backend of OSN. Does that make sense? They're basically proposing to write an S3 plugin, and then OSN pods can become origins to OSG by exporting themselves into the data federation.
That's fantastic. Thank you for the clarification.
Any other question? If not, I have one question. This bring your own resource, that's something really appealing. I think we also have a shared cluster at UCLA with the same approach. I wonder what is the sustainability for such a project?
That's a good question. We've been doing this now since 2005. So we've sustained it for 16, 17 years thereabouts, if I subtract correctly. And it's not always been easy. We went through 4 phases. We're in our 4th phase in a way. Phase 1, we were jointly funded as one project by DOE and NSF. Phase 2, we were separately funded by DOE and NSF, but they allowed us to run us as one project. Phase 3, we lost all of our funding, had to scramble like crazy, and ended up with, I think I had at some point, we had in the interim 6 projects that all agreed to contribute, 6 or 7 funded projects that all agreed to contribute effort in order to keep the consortium and the infrastructure alive. And then right now we're funded via 2 separate grants from the NSF only, and they pay for and all of these kinds of things are 5 years. So there's always a question, what happens at the 5-year boundary? And I think that so far we've managed to find ways to move forwards and survive the transitions. And I think that the secret ingredient to surviving the transition is that we've always had a consortium organization. So as executive director, I'm happen to be the executive director of OSG right now, and my term is for 2 years, and I'm elected. I'm elected by the consortium council.
Mm-hmm.
The consortium council itself is driven by bylaws that it can change. You can think of the consortium as a club. The club can decide to throw out members and add members at will. And there is no funding to the club. And so the consortium at the highest level, the consortium council, is not funded.
Okay.
And therefore, to the extent that people want this to survive, it can survive. And then when you hit a rough patch in the road because one agency doesn't want us anymore or wants to shrink us or whatever, we'll figure it out.
Any other question from the audience? So if not, I thank you, Frank, getting your time out from your busy schedule. I know we had one node at some point, OSG node at UCLA. It was back 2005, 2006, sometime around that. So I am aware of this effort for a long time. And this is a really good approach.
And it's gotten a lot easier.
Okay.
Initially, we started out as a software project, and we provided a software stack, and then told people, "Up, here's the RPM, knock yourself out. This is the instructions. Do whatever you can do." We found that was not really scalable because the amount of effort required to deploy the software, learn how the software is used, learn how all the services get instantiated, how the services are operated, all of that jazz was just too much for even very well-resourced institutions like UCLA, because it provided a very significant hurdle that they had to jump over. And that effort needed to be amortized by the use that the university had of the infrastructure. And that wasn't given in a lot of places, even rich places like the UC system. And so changing to a service organization made a huge difference. Now we actually operate services that instantiate the software stack that we provide. And that way, we can integrate your cluster with little more than you giving us an account, and you allow us to go in there with an SSH key. And then we do everything from remote. All of the gluing into the federation is managed by us. So the amount of effort required went from an FTE in 2007 or so to a small fraction of an FTE, basically to nothing, almost nothing. There is still something because we have to coordinate when you change, say, for example, when you change the batch system you of course have to tell us, and we have to change on our side the API that we're now talking to a different batch system. When you change the queues that you have in your batch system, the configurations, you have to that all has to communicate it. So there is effort involved and there's communication involved, but it is much, much, much less than it used to be in 2008. 2008, it was a big lift. Now it's a little lift.
Okay. Yes, I remember it was a steep learning curve at that time. And I went through that at that time. So I'm happy that to know that it has come along a long way since then, and hopefully.
Yeah, conceptually, we've realized that we have to eat our own dog food in the sense that we want to engage research computing, institutional research computing infrastructure teams. Then we have to behave like a research computing infrastructure team. We have to operate our own hardware, operate our own services, do our own user support, have our own accounts, etc., and do all of this. Everything that we proselytize on, we need to be able to do ourselves. And that transition took a good 5, 6, 7 years. And that transition is now completed. And so now we're in a position where we in a much better position to scale.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Julius, for staying over.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is great.
Thanks, TV, for coordinating.
Yes, and I apologize for the the problems we had because of the last minute change in the agenda. It's just like the person, his company is being taken over by, I mean, which is a great news for him, but he was not able to spare time, and that's what caused the issue. But thanks again. It's been wonderful meeting you all, and hopefully we will meet sometime in person.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.